Welcome back to What Works. I want to talk to you today about something amazing that happened in September 2015. 193 world leaders actually agreed on something. It isn't often they do. And they agreed on the so-called 2030 agenda and the accompanying 17 sustainable development goals. And these goals relate to poverty reduction, hunger, education, health, infrastructure, life over land, life underwater. We're talking about governance. We're talking about unique goals regarding the reduction of inequality, but also partnerships for development. This process of formulating the 17 Sustainable Development Goals was extremely participatory, and thousands of people, governments, organizations, interest groups, civil society actors, scholars were involved in formulating these goals, which replaced the previous Millennium Development Goals. Now, there has been criticism, as usual, that these goals are, for example, too many. Some people, including politicians, have argued why 17 should have had 12 or 8 as the Millennium Development Goals were. We have just too many goals, difficult to measure. And by the way, it's not just 17 SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals. There are also 169 targets and numerous indicators. So there's this kind of frustration perhaps that we have just too much. Others say, oh, this is a bit stupid, there's just a high school wish list of how to save the world. And there have been the usual criticisms about, whether one is able to achieve these. But the praise that the SDG agenda has received has also been phenomenal. Because finally, we actually have an international agenda for the next 13 years. Until 2030, the world will be working together. All countries have signed onto this document, are in a way obligated to work towards promoting these goals. And one aspect that I find really promising, and it may surprise you, is the extent to which the private sector, yes, the private sector is showing interest in international development for what I would say the first time in history. I've never seen, and I have mentioned this to you earlier, I've been doing a lot of work on all the bad things in life, extreme poverty, hunger, and famine. But I've never seen the private sector as interested in partnering with civil society, with national governments, in promoting the SDGs as I see them now. And the crucial role of the private sector becomes even more important when you think about how countries around the world are going to finance these development projects. So one way of funding projects in many developing countries is, of course, through foreign aid. But we know that there's a threat to foreign aid. Many countries are threatening to cut foreign aid, including the United States. Even in my country, Norway, there are a lot of concerns that aid, as generous as we are in providing aid, it is not always used in the right way. So aid is not just something that we can rely on. The second source of funding the Sustainable Development Goals is through countries and their own taxation policies. Many countries are doing a great job. There have been reforms, but a lot of countries still struggle to generate enough revenue. And that's where the third form of funding comes through, is important, which is the private sector funding. And we see now an increasing growth of public-private partnerships. I think almost half of the Fortune 500 companies in the world today have committed themselves to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, there are two arguments as to why companies are doing so. One is, of course, the business case. And you will be able to read more about this in one of the links that we're going to provide to you about how companies really think this is win-win, that customers like the idea that they're doing something for the environment, that companies are not just in it for profit, but you could have a situation where companies want profit and are doing something good. It becomes win-win. But there's also the moral case for businesses to get involved in development. There is this idea now that it is no longer, as Milton Friedman once famously said, the business of business is business. That is no longer the case. And there have been lots of companies who've been practicing corporate social responsibility over a long period, but those have been very arbitrary, most of them been very ad hoc. But now there's this kind of genuine feeling, and there are many activistic CEOs, Unilever has one of them, Paul Polman, who really talk about how important it is for businesses to also pursue morally good goals. Now, you may not always believe them, and there are criticisms that businesses would be able to just cherry pick among the 17 goals, continue just doing what they were doing and somehow repackage their activities. But I've been taking part in many seminars and conferences, but also interactions with companies, and I'm always amazed with these companies who are often sometimes choosing very difficult goals to achieve. We have Telenor, a Norwegian company, a big major telecommunications company, that has identified SDG 10, inequality reduction, as one of their most important goals. So we see something phenomenal happening. And I think we have to move beyond simply criticizing and questioning the profit motive towards identifying ways in which private companies can work together with governments, with scholars providing advice, and civil society organizations, people's interest groups, and political parties. The time really has come to talk about solutions. What is it that the private sector are not good at? And let's try and identify some solutions and some suggestions which would make the private sector better equipped to promote development through their businesses in many parts of the world. So I encourage you to have a discussion about this, the role of the private sector in development. In terms of funding, there's a lot of talk about blended finance, how rich countries, national governments, and private sector companies can perhaps pool their resources together in generating resources for development. So in conclusion, I think the discourse on the SDGs is fascinating, and there's a lot of course, this kind of hallelujah kind of talk, oh, everything is fine, etc. I think a very important corrective to that is trying to better understand that it is no longer really about poor countries and rich countries. The whole 2030 agenda is really about us. We're all in the same boat, and what can we do to promote development that just does not mean development in poorer parts of the world, but also in affluent parts of the world. Norway, one of the richest countries of the world where I live in, we have several challenges which we also need to address as part of the SDG agenda. And if we can involve the private sector in this, let's discuss how best that can take place. Thank you very much.